The morning I understood what my husband had decided for me, I was standing in Miriam Lapp's kitchen with my hands in a basin of cold water and a newborn that had arrived too fast and too still. The baby made one sound, a small, wet gasp, and then nothing. I pressed my fingers against the base of its skull the way my own teacher had once pressed mine, searching for the pulse that tells you whether you are working toward life or working toward memory. Sleet ticked against the window glass. The kitchen held the smell of wood smoke and the iron salt that follows every birth. I found the pulse. The baby lived. And when I walked home 4 hours later, my husband Jacob told me I was not permitted to leave the house without his written permission for the next 6 months. He said it the way a man might say the bread was ready, flat, settled, already decided before I walked through the door. I served as a midwife for 23 years in an Old Order settlement in Holmes County, Ohio, a community of 280 souls who trusted me with the thing they trusted no one else with, the beginning of life, the end of it, and everything in between that the outside world was not supposed to see. What I witnessed at those bedsides was the reason I eventually could not stay. But it took far longer than it should have, and the reason it took so long is the same reason my husband could make that announcement in the kitchen and know I had nothing to answer him with. Now, let me tell you about the punishment. In that community, a husband is not a partner. The word itself does not quite exist. He is the head. The bishop said it plainly at every wedding I attended across 23 years of community life. The husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. This was not offered as metaphor or spiritual suggestion open to interpretation. It was a set of instructions. A wife asks permission to visit her sister. She asks permission to take the children to a neighbor's farm. She asks permission to accept money for her sewing. And a midwife, a woman whose calling by its very nature demands that she move freely at any hour, pulled from sleep in the cold and the dark. In the middle of a birth, she asks permission too, in the form of a general permission granted once at the start of her service, and assumed to hold indefinitely, because even the men understood that a woman in labor could not wait. That general permission was what Jacob had decided to revoke. He had reasons. I had stepped outside his expectations in ways I will explain. But I want you to feel the architecture of that world first, because the architecture is the story. A woman in that community has no money that is legally her own. She has no vehicle. She walks or she is driven. She sends no letters without her husband reading them first, not because a rule requires it, but because the expectation is total enough that a written rule would be redundant. I heard the same phrase from 3 different women in 3 different years, spoken each time with the same tone of tired instruction. You do not need to understand it. You need to trust it. Understanding was not for wives. Trust was. The cost of that system is not visible from the outside. From outside, it looks like simplicity. From inside, it feels like learning to breathe in a room where the ceiling drops an inch every year. It was late November of 1998. I was 34 years old and had been married to Jacob for 11 years. Our children were 9, 7, and 4. The delivery that had taken me to Miriam Lapp's kitchen that morning was the 3rd call I had answered in 6 days, without, in Jacob's view, adequate preparation of the house before I left. He had come home to a cold stove on Tuesday. He had found the youngest still in his nightclothes at noon on Thursday. On Saturday morning, the morning of the Lapp birth, I had left before he was awake because Miriam's sister had come to the door at 4 in the morning, and there was no time and no choice. 3 offenses, 1 decision. When he told me the terms, I set my midwife bag on the table and said, "Women will call in the night, Jacob. They will need me. Then, they will need someone else." He said he was not shouting. I need you to understand that. He was not a man who shouted. He was a man who decided. And the deciding was worse than shouting because it closed the door before you could get your foot into it. I spent the first week believing it would pass. I wrote a note to the bishop framed as a question about duty. Jacob read it before I could send it and set it in the stove. I am not describing cruelty. He would not have described it as cruelty either. He would have called it order. He believed in order the way I believed in checking for a pulse, with the certainty that it was what kept things alive. On the 14th day, Emma Troyer sent her oldest boy to my door. Emma was 22 and in her second pregnancy. Her first had not gone easily. The boy stood on my porch with his hat in his hands and said his mother had been laboring since the night before, and the family wanted me. I stood at the door for a long time. Jacob was in the barn. My daughter was at the window behind me. I thought about what I was, what I had been called to be, what my hands knew how to do. Then I thought about what I'd already promised, not to Jacob, but to the women of that community, a promise that had existed before my marriage and that I believed would outlast it. I picked up my bag. I said nothing to my daughter. I walked across the yard and into the barn and I said, "Emma Troyer is in labor, and I am going." Jacob set down his tools. "No," he said. "Yes," I said. I want you to understand that I had never said it quite like that before. One syllable, with nothing behind it to soften or explain it. I walked out of the barn and down the road, and did not look back, and my hands did not shake until I was past the Yoder fence and out of sight of the house. Emma's baby came at midday. A girl, healthy, with a good cry and a strong grip around my thumb when I put it in her palm. Emma wept with relief. I sat with her for 2 hours afterward the way I always did, and we talked about very little. The cold, the baby's hair, what the older children would think. Emma had a gentleness I had always associated with her. She had come to me once, 6 months before, and sat at my kitchen table and said she was frightened of her own husband, not of violence, but of disappearing, of becoming smaller and smaller until there was not enough of her left to fill a dress. I held that in my chest the whole walk home. Jacob was at the kitchen table when I came in. He said one sentence, "You have put yourself outside this family's protection." I put my bag down. I sat across from him. I said, "What does that mean?" He explained it the way he would explain anything, as though the clarity of it was obvious to any reasonable person. He would not intercede on my behalf with the bishop. He would not speak for me at community events. He would make clear to the deacons that I had defied a directive. He would not cast me out. He was not, he said, a cruel man, but he would remove his covering. That is the word they used, covering. A husband's spiritual and social protection over his wife's standing in the community. Without it, I was not expelled. I was simply exposed. I learned after I left that this practice has a name. My therapist called it coercive control, a pattern of behavior that strips away resources, social support, and freedom of movement in order to enforce compliance. She said it the way you say a word in a language you have spoken your whole life, and have only just learned to spell. I had lived inside that pattern for 11 years and had no name for it. I had called it marriage. I had called it faith. I had called it the way things are, the way they are, everywhere, the way they have always been. What I did in the weeks that followed was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no flight, no single clarifying moment. I began writing things down in the small notebook I kept in my midwife bag, because Jacob never opened my midwife bag. He found the body and its workings repellent. That bag was the only private space I had in the world. I wrote in it at bedsides, between contractions, in the half-dark while mothers slept. I wrote down dates, words, the specific details of what was being withheld, and why. I wrote down Emma's name. I wrote down the word covering. I wrote down the date I walked out of the barn. After I left the community, and I will tell that story separately because it deserves its own time, I took that notebook with me. It is the only object I carried out. I have it still. The cover is pale blue, worn at the corners, and the clasp was broken even when I bought it. I do not read it often. I do not need to. I know what it says. What my husband imposed on me in those months, the revocation of my freedom of movement, The withdrawal of social standing as punishment for defiance would constitute, in most jurisdictions outside that community, a form of domestic abuse under coercive control statutes. England criminalized it in 2015. Scotland followed. Several states in this country have begun to recognize it. But inside that community in 1998, it was not abuse. It was theology. It was the natural expression of a structure that had been in place for 300 years, and that the community believed came directly from God. I am not here to tell you that everyone in that community was cruel. They were not. The women who brought meals after a birth were genuinely kind. The men who helped roof a neighbor's barn in the rain were genuinely generous. The faith, in its quieter moments, was genuinely beautiful, and I do not want to take that from anyone who holds it. But beauty and harm can live in the same house. I learned that at 34, standing in my kitchen across from a man who was not angry but certain, who believed, with his whole self, that what he was doing was right for me and for our children and for the community and for God. The certainty was the hardest part. It left no room for argument, because you cannot argue with a man who has already consulted a higher authority than you. Emma Troyer, as far as I know, is still in Holmes County. Her daughter, the one I delivered, would be 27 years old now. I do not know what her life looks like. I do not know whether she is happy. I have thought about her, that small, fierce grip around my thumb, more times than I can count. There is a thread I cannot follow, and I have learned to let it lie. What I can tell you is this: the notebook still has the clasp that never worked, and I still carry it. Not because I need it anymore, but because I remember what it felt like to have that bag as my only private space in the world, and I am not willing to forget what that cost. If any of this is finding you where you live, tell me your story when you are ready. Leave it in the comments. Tell me what part of this settled in you and stayed. You may never have lived in a settlement in Ohio. You may have grown up in a city, in a different faith, in a house that looked nothing like mine. But if you have ever been told that your movement, your voice, and your choices were not yours to make, then you know what I am describing. You have known it in your own body. There is a sentence I have never said out loud before this moment. I am going to say it now. I was not a disobedient wife. I was a woman whose compliance had been mistaken for 11 years for the absence of a self. What I carried out of that community I carry here, so that what happened in the dark does not stay there.